Okay, so can everybody hear my voice at the moment? Okay, so I have a presentation, so I'm going to share my screen because I'm a visual learner. So would I be able to get screen sharing in that sense? Because it says that the host has disabled it.
Yep, you should be good.
Okay, awesome. Thank you for that. Hi, everyone. My name is Gizem. I am a second-year PhD student at the American Culture Studies Department at Bowling Green State University. I am joining all of you from New York, and today my presentation is entitled as Borders, Boundaries, and Beyond, Crossing Turkey, Greece, and Bulgaria with an Open Wound. Within my presentation and research, the research questions I have is that, in what ways does the discursive shifts and productions of President Erdogan's and the Justice and Development Party's public speeches and statements affect refugees, migrants, borders, and border policies? How and why have the border lines of Turkey, Greece, and Bulgaria transformed into borderlands? And most importantly, what does this signify for the region? So the argument I'm making within this paper and presentation is that Turkish border lines with Greece and Bulgaria have transformed into a borderland due to President Erdogan's and the Justice and Development Party's shifting discursive productions and practices against refugees and migrants between the years 2014 to 2020. The method and methodology that I've used in my presentation is heavily based on critical discourse analysis. Critical discourse analysis, as most of you know, explores and questions power and power relationships. It looks at the representation of self and other and the polarization of us and them. But most importantly, it looks at the construction of manipulation through positive self-representation and negative other representation. So what I have done is that by analyzing public speeches and statements from the official presidency of the Republic of Turkey website, as well as I have used media resources from the years 2014 to 2020, I have seen a kind of different discursive shifts over the years, and to really make it more detailed and clear to all of you, within my paper, I have divided these discursive productions into three chronologically separate timeframes. The first time frame is between the year 2014 to 2015. And this is when the open door policy is constructed by President Erdogan and his party, the GDP. They talk about religious solidarity and humanitarian values. And in the second discursive time frame, that encompasses 2016 to February 28, 2020. And in this time frame, there are also other sub-discourses within this time frame. There's three. The first one is refugees and migrants are seen as economic contributors to the Turkish state. Second of all, refugees and migrants, once they were seen as like brothers and sisters and Muslim fellows, there's a transition in that discourse which creates refugees and migrants becoming a burden on the Turkish state. And the third kind of discourse that's created within this time frame is that openly President Erdogan and the GDP start blaming Europe and the European Union for not funding the so-and-so called refugee crisis, and they start threatening the European Union. And the last time frame that I look at is very recent. It's just like 1 year ago, and it encompasses February 28, 2020, and that is when President Erdogan specifically says that he has opened the doors and the doors of the Turkish borders surrounding Greece and Bulgaria, and he specifically says to refugees and migrants that you could go and leave. So my project focuses on really critical discourse analysis and, more importantly, her open wound metaphor. So Gloria Anzaldúa sees the US-Mexico border as an open wound where the third world grates against the first and bleeds. And before a scab forms, it hemorrhages again, the lifeblood of two worlds merging to form a third country, a border culture. So within this context and reference, even though Anzaldúa does state this in relation to the US-Mexico border, we could also see echoes of these in a global sense. So if you do take a look at the Turkish, Bulgarian, and Greek border, the border is an open wound, and there's also the meeting of the global north and global south, the east and west, how you might put it, and you kind of see how there is an open wound being created by three countries that have a part and that take a part within what's happening even today. A few things that I would like to mention before I get off and talk about the discursive timeframes in a detailed sense is that one thing we need to know is that border lines are fixed, stable, and dividing geographical lines due to a treaty. They distinguish us from them, and they define places that are safe and unsafe. But when we think about borderlands, these are infected environments, which are a lot of lives are lost. They're sites and symbols of power, and most importantly, they're vague and undetermined places created by emotional residue of an unnatural boundary. So I just wanted to show you a map of what I'm really talking about and really situate it in context. So Turkey's border is right here within the Edirne province, but you see Bulgaria and Greece. So I will be talking about how this border has become a borderland throughout time within these different discursive productions and formations. The first time frame that I've talked before in a detailed sense is that if we look at 2014 to 2015, we see that President Erdogan and the GDP referred to Syrian refugees and various migrants as brothers and sisters and guests and Muslim fellows. But then with time, and as you could see, there are examples like it's stated as we open our homes to them, we share our bread. They are Syrian guests under temporary protection. So within this discourse, there are also a lot of problems. Even though President Erdogan and the GDP, they present themselves as humane, moral, responsible, caring toward Muslim refugees and migrants, because Syrians are not accepted as legal refugees and they're put into the discourse as guests, this means that they are not entitled to any kind of legal protection. So they don't have rights, they don't have legal protection. This leaves Syrian refugees and their status within a very vulnerable position. So what has been constructed with the open door policy between the years 2014 to 2015 is not a human rights approach or anything that's about human rights. It's more about a generosity discourse within President Erdogan and the GDP, because they create this kind of religious solidarity and historical responsibility arising from the Ottoman past. So this is kind of like the discourse and the open door policy that's been constructed by them. The second discursive time frame falls between 2016 to February 28, 2020. And remember, I talked about three sub-discourses that emerge in this time frame because a lot is happening. It's when even the Mediterranean refugee crisis has been heightened between the years 2015, 16, and going on to 17. So within this time frame, President Erdogan and the GDP, they have quit their religious solidarity and that kind of caring discourse, and they specifically state refugees and migrants being a burden on the Turkish state. And they do reiterate this in their public speeches that I have researched with. And we see that within their public speeches, they also talk about how we have to send them back. So there, again, there's this kind of like us and them discourse that's being created. Like they're foreigners, they're people that should not be here. So like it's very interesting in that sense. And then the second sub-discourse is all about citizenship and refugees and migrants. Remember, when they came to Turkey, they were not giving any legal status or citizenship in that sense. But when it's about general elections, which happens in June 2018, and then on March 2019, we had a local election. We had 22,000 Syrians become Turkish citizens, and then in March 2019, we had 54,000 Syrians naturalized, and they were recently as voting contributors. And the third kind of sub-discourse within this time frame is when President Erdogan heavily starts blaming Europe and the European Union for not funding the so-called refugee crisis, and starts threatening the European Union. So we could see how the threatening discourse transitions into a blaming discourse. And last but not least, my research is more focused on the third discursive time frame, which starts with February 28, 2020, because there's not a lot of research done within this topic yet. So President Erdogan, within the specific date, states that, what did we do yesterday? We opened the doors. We will not close those doors. Why? Because the European Union should keep its promises. We are not in a situation to handle a new wave of refugees from Syria. So within opening the Turkish borders or the Turkish doors within Greece and Bulgaria, Turkey and the other countries surrounding has started to bear witness to the bounded experiences of refugees and migrants. So what happened within this time frame is that when President Erdogan claimed to have opened the doors, an estimated 30,000 and even more migrants gathered at the checkpoints within the Bulgarian and Greece border. And more than 4 million asylum seekers have been allowed to leave Turkey on February 28, 2020. So within this discursive formations that have happened over time, so what is Turkey's policy? What is President Erdogan or GDP trying to do? Are they creating cartographies of exclusion or belonging? I leave it to you. So one important thing is that when President Erdogan stated that he had opened the doors, migrants and refugees, not just from Syria, but from Iraq, Iran, Pakistan, and from African countries and even from Afghanistan, made their way to the Turkish border line with Greece and Bulgaria. And a lot of them experienced militarized policing, hazardous crossings by sea, and deadly encounters. And what happened is that when this discursive formation was created by the GDP and President Erdogan, a lot of people went to the borders, right? But this also led to the militarizing of the border within Greece and Bulgaria. So what happened was that there were a lot of heavy ammunition. There were a lot of violence that was created within the border. So what happened in that sense was that, I just want to get to this photo, is that the militarization of the border created multiple surveillance and security measures. It created a violent and cruel borderland region, but more importantly, it created a very high security landscape and a topography of cruelty. So it pushed migrants and refugees to cross even much more dangerous corners, both land and sea, because you have a country opening its doors and borders, but you have two other countries that don't have to or don't open their borders. So what happens? We have refugees and migrants become stuck in a very liminal space of violence. So within that sense, this is just kind of like a photo from that time frame. We see how step by step a border and borderlines become a borderland, and especially a topography of cruelty. So within that sense, within this place, the Edirne province that we share with Greece and Bulgaria and that Turkey shares, there's a circulation of life and death. More importantly, there's also movement in the environment. It's February, so there's temperature differences. There are different wild animals. It transitions from day to night. So there are many hardships that migrants and refugees go through within this liminal space. And there are a few people that are able to get to their destination, I'm going to say, to another safe space that they could feel that they could belong. But one quote that I really like, and I want to share it within this experience and sense, is that to set off is to die a little, and to arrive is never to arrive. So within the case of and context of refugees and migrants in Turkey, it's constantly a search for belonging, visibility, constantly searching for a safe place that you will be accepted and that you could create a life. So within this context, my presentation, the main takeaways to take away from it is that the Justice and Development Party have created discursive and political practices and they exercise state power within Europe's selective border politics, and they use the bodies of migrants and refugees as a weaponizing tool. And what happens is that these discursive and political shifts have heightened the militarization of the borderlines, both on land and sea. And within this context, Greece and Bulgaria have created a complex security landscape and a topography of cruelty, which has resulted in a borderland. And in the end, Turkey, Greece, and Bulgaria all play a role in constructing, widening, and thickening the borderlands, which creates an open wound. So families, futures, bodies, as well as individual and collective spaces of trauma, vulnerability, and displacement emerge among the spaces refugees and migrants dwell. So I just want to finish my presentation here, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much, Gizem. It was a very insightful presentation. I really enjoyed it. Please keep your questions at the end of the session. There will be a Q&A. So in our second speaker is on diffusion of transatlantic migration policies, borders, and exclusion. She did her undergraduate in UCLA. Currently, she is a second-year MA candidate in the German European Studies program at Georgetown University, with a concentration in immigration, diplomacy, and asylum policies. Kyliah worked as an intern in the US State Department, as well as a graduate research assistant for the Institute for the Study of International Migration. So, Kyliah, if you are ready, you can start.
Yep, sure thing. Thank you for the introduction. So I'm going to begin sharing my screen. Can you all see this and hear me? Great. Okay, thank you for having me. The title of this work, which is a shorter and broader piece of my master's thesis, is titled Diffusion of Transatlantic Migration Policies, Borders, and Exclusion. So similarly, before I get to the actual meat of the presentation, I think it's important to kind of clarify what I mean when I say borders and exclusion. So definitively, the Merriam-Webster definition will tell you that borders are a dividing line between two separate countries. This, I argue, however, is incomplete. But if you keep scrolling, it also gives you synonyms such as boundaries, margins, thresholds, and edges. And I think this is a more accurate description because borders transcend geography and can be liminal spaces where individuals' right to livelihood is imperiled and where the politicized form of inclusion via citizenship is created and contested. So I'm hoping to give you a taste of how all of these concepts and their subsequent policies and practices are being employed across the transatlantic space and are building on one another to the detriment of migrants. All right, so policies and practices. So while this list is absolutely not exhaustive and I can't allot the time to each that they deserve, I do want to touch on some of the main policies and practices that are being used by the US, various EU member states, and the European Union itself. So first we have the most visible practices with migrant detention and physical structures such as fences. Then there are the actual actors implementing these practices. So in the US, we have ICE and CBP, along with a few other hosts of DHS agencies. But in Europe, because the European Union is comprised of 27 member states, each nation has their own individual guards, but their competencies aren't aligned with the powers of CBP and ICE. So a better approximate for this would be Frontex and the European Union Naval Force, which is also known as Operation Sophia. And then lastly, we have externalization and bilateral migration agreements. So in the US context, there's MPP or Migration Protection Protocols, or colloquially it's known as the Remain in Mexico policy. And in the European Union, there are a variety of agreements such as Spain, Morocco, Italy, and Libya, and what the bulk of my thesis comprises of, which is the EU-Turkey Joint Action Plan. However, within this last group, the aim of these policies is to contain migrants in their countries of origin and transit. So firstly, I'm going to start with migration detention. So entire books could and have been written about the atrocities committed in detention centers. And one slide again doesn't do the topic justice, but I'm going to try to be as concise and brief, but also do the best I can with this large topic. So immigration detention in the US officially began in the 1890s at Ellis Island on the East Coast, and this happened immediately after the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, 1888, and so forth. It also coincides with the arrival of Europeans, mainly Westerners, so Italians, Germans, and so forth. Right now, the US has the largest detention camp infrastructure in the world, with over 960 sites, and they are mainly under the control of CBP and ICE. During fiscal year 2018, around 400,000 people were booked into ICE custody and around 42,000 were held daily. Immigration in the US is not a new phenomenon, and so detention centers have been constructed and cultivated over time. However, reports consistently refer to human rights abuses, and these include inadequate and unprofessional medical care, so a lack of wash capacity, so that refers to hygiene. There's no blankets. We see these foil kind of makeshift blankets covering children outside of gates. There's also been reports of forced hysterectomies. In addition to this, there is a lack of access to legal representation and other forms of advocacy because a lot of these detention centers are located in rural areas. And the picture presented in this slide is actually of a detention center in the US in Eastern Texas in Polk County with a population of around 7,000 and 3,000 of those are migrants in detention centers. And then there's again, deaths and family separation, which we know a ton about. And so while the US detention system is unique in its own right, European nations originally practicing something known as reception rather than detention because it's considered a faster and more humane way of processing irregular migrants has started to implement similar detention policies. Again, moving it to the European context, 57,000 migrants in 2011 arrived to a small island in Italy. Subsequently, the Italian government under the Berlusconi administration extended the maximum duration of detention to migrants awaiting deportation from 6 to 18 months. And a lot of this, again, revolved around the context of the Arab Spring in 2011, where Europe began experiencing large influxes of migrants, specifically in Greece, Italy, Malta, and Spain. And then moving on to Greece. Greece detention centers are often referred to as Europe's Guantanamo Bay, which is problematic in itself. And the European Court of Human Rights has recently ruled that the detention center in Greece has violated the ban on torture, humane, and degrading treatment. So while I won't go into the specifics of what migrants endured in both the Italian and Grecian centers, it's kind of easy to make the connection between Europe and America's detention policies, both of which have committed vast human rights violations. And so now we're going to the second part of the policies, and that's physical structures. So the US-Mexico border fence is 649 miles long, which covers a third of the US national border, and it's covered with a variety of surveillance equipment, including sensors, cameras, and at some points is even rumored to be electrified. And it's mainly under the supervision of US Border Patrol. And so while the border fence was originally started in 1853 and construction continued under the Bush administration, former President Donald Trump actually throughout his 2016 campaign called for the construction of a much larger border wall, giving us what we see today. And when we move to Europe, Hungary has also erected an 175-kilometer long barbed wire fence to push back its asylum seekers, again, violating 2 articles of the European Charter of Human Rights, which pretty much look at the ways national governments implement policies to prevent migrants from applying to asylum. Similarly, Austria, Bulgaria, and Slovenia have implemented similar policies and have erected their own border fences. However, this isn't an Eastern European phenomenon. I think Eastern Europe is generally viewed as more so anti-immigrant sentiments, especially given its large Christian population. So allowing, say, Muslims to come in is not in its character. However, this is also occurring in Spain, and the borders of these Spanish enclaves are also surrounded by 2 sets of meter-high barbed wire fences, and that is the picture in the lower left-hand corner. This too has also violated European Charter of Human Rights standards. However, because these 2 fences are technically located in Northern Africa, it's been able to bypass a lot of EU standards. Thirdly, there's border control. So the Mediterranean has 3 main migratory routes. However, the Central Mediterranean route, which is demonstrated by this blue line in the middle of Africa, refers to the sea journey from Northern Africa, mainly Libya and Tunisia, to Italy. And this is the most used route, again, since the onset of the Arab Spring. The CMR has accounted for almost 88% of all recorded deaths along the Mediterranean since 2014, while accounting for only 25% of arrivals. So you can imagine the death toll happening in the Mediterranean, and if you look more narrowly at the CMR route. So contributing to these worsening conditions for those using the CMR, Frontex and the European Union Naval Force Mediterranean, also known as Operation Sophia, and is the EU's external border agency, has worsened these conditions. So Operation Sophia's efforts to disrupt smuggling networks have put migrants at greater risk because it's led to the destruction of smugglers' boats, which in turn force smugglers and migrants to send out less seaworthy inflatable boats, which capsize easily, especially considering the number of migrants that attempt to fit on it. And secondly, the increased arrest of smugglers has induced migrants to go and travel without an actual escort or without an actual smuggler. And it's easy to see how migrants that get lost are unable to navigate the waters. And again, unknown weather conditions force a lot of boats to capsize. So these similar efforts, the smug struggling, have also been implemented in the US. So in the US, there are 2 main border agency controls, which I mentioned earlier. So there's CBP, which is supposed to focus on enforcement at the border. And then there's also ICE, which is focusing on enforcement of immigration laws in the interior of the country. So since 1953, Border Patrol has been authorized to operate anywhere within 100 miles of the US land and coastal border, which is an area that encompasses 2/3 of the US population. And ICE's functions include arresting people and putting them into immigration proceedings, managing immigrant detention, and also deporting people. However, both of these agencies, similar to Operation Sophia and Frontex, are not known for their protection of human rights. So CBP agents have been caught dumping out water left for migrants in the Arizona desert. CBP facilities are also the place where we see viral images of children in cages, and that's where those come from. There's also ICE. So ICE is infamous for conducting workplace raids around the country to arrest undocumented migrants. ICE and CBP are also responsible for the enforcement of Trump's family separation policy, where children and parents were split up because children cannot be placed in criminal jails, but adults can. And these children were designated as unaccompanied alien children, of which 600 still are separated from their families. And lastly, there's externalization. So externalization refers to pushback measures used to ensure that migrants don't enter destination countries. These measures are typically exercised outside of states' territory, and methods include offshore visa controls, detention centers, asylum processing centers, maritime controls, anti-smuggling operations, and diplomatic agreement with third countries. And the European Union is infamous for this. And extraterritorial policies have become a method of circumventing international humanitarian law, specifically the 1951 Geneva Convention relating to the status of refugees, which states that you're not going to return refugees to a country in which they could face persecution. And this is known as refoulement. However, the European Union and US have both implemented these policies chronologically, which build on one another, as the slide shows. So there's the 2016 EU-Turkey Joint Action Plan. The main component of this agreement was that in exchange for Ankara hosting irregular migrants attempting to enter Greece, the EU agreed to resettle Syrian refugees hosted in Turkey on a one-to-one basis. There are other smaller components to this. There's a monetary payout of around $6 billion, $3 million of which the Turkish government claims to have not seen to support Syrians hosted in the country. There's also the attempt to re-energize EU-Turkey accession talks to permit Turkey to enter to EU. There's also the 2017 Italy-Libya Memorandum of Understanding, which again attempted to stem the influx of migrants. However, this deal was controversial in the sense that Italy made a deal with Libya, who, as we know, is increasingly authoritarian, and has resulted in 20,000 people being intercepted in the Mediterranean and taken back to the detention centers in Libya, some of which have been airstrikes since. And then in 2018, there are the Migration Protection Protocols, or MPP, again, forcing asylum seekers attempting to enter the US to remain in Mexico during the immigration proceedings, where Mexico is responsible for their humanitarian protection. However, in this setting, a lot of migrants experience criminal gang activity, sexual assault, and other forms of gender-based violence. So overall, this presentation is extremely broad. However, I think it covers some of the main points. And I wanted to emphasize the fact that borders have become a natural order that regulates the movement of people, but in a politicized sense where refugees become illegal. So the portrayal of refugees as victims who need to be rescued or villains who crossed illegally obscure their agency and reifies the power of states to secure their borders. So the United States at the southern border with Mexico and the European Union at the southern peripheral countries are excluding migrants, particularly those of color. And while each of these entities are condemning the other's policies, they're implementing them at home. So migrants at these thresholds demonstrates that borders have become a space where individuals are stripped of their rights, dignity, and humanity. And so, as the slide says, for some, the border is life, it's legality and its rights, and for others, it's death, illegality, and rightlessness. The successful crossing of borders is a mechanism in which the former can be achieved, but in the meantime, those undertaking the journey are positioned on the threshold. And then I'll end there.
Stage is yours.
Thank you, Mert. I'm just going to start playing that. Hopefully everyone can see it. Great. Quickly do one quick thing, sorry. Great. Hello, everyone. My name is Abarna.
I'm Eliza.
And I'm Karina.
And our presentation will be on Displaced, the legal construction of state security, terrorism, and its implications for refugee seekers from Sri Lanka. Pictured here is a father named Muthaiya Devendran, a Tamil father who is searching for his forcibly disappeared son. This Tamil father has been looking for a son who was made forcibly disappeared in the 1990s. And Sri Lanka has one of the highest number of enforced disappearances around the world, coming in between 60,000 to 100,000 forced disappearances. And to this point, many families, often led by Tamil mothers, have been protesting roadside for 4 years, demanding for the fate of their missing loved ones. They recently commemorated the 4th year anniversary. They've been protesting since 2017, asking for where the fate of their forcibly disappeared loved ones are. And even amidst even amidst the most violent, oppressive situations that they face under the Sri Lankan state, their resistance remains as powerful as ever.
This presentation will discuss how the Sri Lankan state was able to neutralize the political cost of producing refugee seekers by labeling Tamil political activity terrorism and Tamil people terrorists. Sri Lanka has used law to build a singular exclusive national identity that justifies the state's use of security legislation to militarize against the Tamil people and portray their resistance as terrorism. Sri Lanka's national security narrative was supported by the majority of the international community in the 1980s, 1990s, and early 2000s. This international support reaffirmed the state's sovereignty and failed to address the issue of Tamil displacement or prevent further Tamil persecution. By designating Tamils as terrorists, the Sri Lankan state narrowed Tamil refugee seekers' resettlement options, limiting international willingness to accommodate them and negatively shaping the ways that host countries received them.
We want to note that we are taking a historical approach in this presentation because this project exists in the past, present, and future. Most of the remedies to the conflict proposed by the international legal community have been ahistorical, meaning that they do not take into account the singular exclusive national identity built into Sri Lanka's state structures, nor the island's absence from various international human rights conventions. The conflict and Tamil refugee seekers' experiences must therefore be examined within their historical context. Sri Lanka has historically been inhabited by diverse ethnic, cultural, and religious groups, including the majority Buddhist Sinhalese and the minority Hindu, Christian, and Muslim Tamils. These identities were much more flexible before British colonial rule, which began in 1815. British rule was the first time that the island was designated a single political entity under one administrative structure. A feeling of marginalization amongst the Sinhalese majority, combined with a general rejection of imposed British values, left fertile ground for a budding Sinhalese Buddhist nationalism.
The island gained independence as a democratic, centralized, unitary state in 1948. Its constitution was drafted with input from old British administration and included the term unitary state, which is a foundational rejection of separatist movements. According to the text, in quotes, Parliament could not confer upon any community or religion a benefit which was not conferred on other communities or religions. While this seemed to guarantee equal rights for all ethnic communities in Sri Lanka, it can equally be interpreted as reinforcing the pretense of a unified populace and as justification for denying community-specific rights. Shortly after independence, Tamil politicians began arguing that many Sinhalese politicians weren't interested in building a multi-ethnic state. In 1956, Sinhala was made Sri Lanka's only official language through the Sinhala Only Act, meaning that government services would only be offered in Sinhalese. Passing legislation supporting an exclusive ethno-linguistic identity signals that the Sri Lankan state considered the Sinhalese Buddhist citizens the true representation of the country. By the late 1950s, Sinhalese Buddhist nationalism became the ideological framework within which politics were created. Excluded from the state's framework, many Tamil leaders began arguing for Tamil federal autonomy, and rights protests like sit-ins and strikes increased during the time.
In 1972, a new constitution declared that the state would, in quotes, grant to Buddhism the foremost place, and accordingly it shall be the duty of the state to protect and foster Buddhism, end quote. The 1972 Constitution established rule on the basis of popular sovereignty, vested entirely in governing officials who by this point overwhelmingly represented Sinhalese interests. During this same period, Tamil activism continued to grow outside of political forums, and, almost simultaneously, the state began to apply terrorism rhetoric to Tamil political activity. This terrorism rhetoric was quickly extended to the entire Tamil ethnicity, not just to Tamil political activists, so that within Sri Lanka, Tamil quickly began to signify terrorist. By the mid-1970s, the main goal of Tamil rights activism was political secession. In 1976, the Tamil United Liberation Front, or TULF, adopted the Vadukodai Resolution, which called for the creation of a separate state of Tamil Eelam through legal, non-violent means. However, an increasingly violent climate within Sri Lanka resulted in TULF losing some support. Anti-Tamil pogroms in 1977 and the state's lack of response to this violence are cited as the primary reason for increasing radicalization and disillusionment with TALF's peaceful legal approach to separatism. The anti-separatist leanings of a newly elected Sri Lankan government resulted in further criminalization of Tamil contestation, including expanding security legislation.
Now, the first instance of national security legislation was the Public Security Ordinance Act, or PSOA, of 1947, which granted governing officials sweeping powers to preserve public order. According to the PSOA, emergency regulations could authorize the detention of persons, authorize the search and entry of any premises, and authorize the possession of any property on behalf of the state. In 1979, the Prevention of Terrorism Act, or the PTA, was enacted as supplementary legislation to eliminate threats to the unified Sri Lankan state. According to Section 21H, any person who, by words either spoken or intended to be read, or by signs or by visible representations, or otherwise causes or intends to cause commissions of acts of violence, or religious, racial, or communal disharmony, or feelings of ill will, or hostility between different communities or racial or religious groups could be guilty of an offense. Consequently, any person connected with or suspected of being connected with unlawful activity could be imprisoned and tried before Sri Lanka's second highest court, and that too without a preliminary trial, highlighting how these offenses were perceived as threats to the state. Together, the PSOA and the PTA facilitated the harsh policing and punishment of Tamil dissent.
Several armed Tamil groups emerged in the late 70s to the early 80s. Militarization itself was a response to increased ethnic polarization, a sense of shared victimization among Tamils, and a lack of response from political leaders. The Liberation Tigers of Tamilulam, or the LTTE, eventually became the dominant political and militant group representing the Tamil people. Political and ethnic tensions continued to grow with the rise of Tamil militancy. In July 1983, Sri Lankan soldiers kidnapped and raped several Tamil schoolgirls. Tamil guerrilla fighters responded by killing the soldiers, which resulted in retaliatory riots or Sinhalese-led riots that broke out across the southern province of Colombo. Sinhala mobs equipped with Tamil voter registration lists supplied to them by Sinhalese politicians targeted Tamil-owned houses and shops. Tamil civilians were killed, raped, pulled from public buses, and burned while their possessions were destroyed. Rather than contain the violence, the state chartered buses and planes to transport injured Tamil civilians to the northern province of Jaffna. This period, known as Black July, was the first of many times that the Sri Lankan state would sponsor the mass displacement of Tamil peoples. Around 3,000 Tamils were killed, 150,000 were internally displaced, and 300,000 fled the island to seek refuge elsewhere. The government widely publicized news of the Tamil militants' killing of Sinhalese soldiers, yet heavily censored reports about Sinhalese mobs' attacks against Tamil civilians, and did not include the number of Tamil deaths and casualties. Focusing only on Tamil violence made the state's curtailing of Tamil rights seem like a justifiable way to preserve public order. A few weeks prior to Black July, President Jayawardena at the time commented on rising ethnic tensions, stating, "I am not worried about the opinion of the Tamil people. Now we cannot think of them, not about their lives or their opinion. Really, if I starve the Tamils out, the Sinhala people will be happy."
Official civil war between the Sri Lankan state and the LTTE began in the aftermath of Black July and lasted 26 years. Asylum seekers began fleeing the country en masse. In August 1986, 155 Tamils arrived in lifeboats off the coast of Newfoundland. Then Prime Minister Brian Mulroney stated that, quote, "Canada was built by immigration and refugees, and those who arrive in lifeboats will not be turned away," end quote. Though there was immense racist public backlash, the refugees were provided ministers' permits, granting them temporary residence and permission to work and access medical and welfare benefits. Not every group of refuge seekers received this welcome from destination states. Following Black July, the international community led by India and the United States expressed a commitment to maintaining the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Sri Lanka. Encouraged by Sri Lankan lobbying, Western politicians began employing the term terrorism in the 1980s to refer to Tamil militancy, a label which was then incorporated into foreign state laws by a string of countries designating the LTTE as a terrorist organization in the 1990s and early 2000s. This provided legitimacy to the Sri Lankan state by implying that their persecution of Tamils was justified. Additionally, it provided legitimacy to prospective host countries' rejection of Tamil refugee seekers as potential security threats. Events that transpired in Sri Lanka also caused ripple effects for Tamil refugee seekers abroad. In 2006, the Sri Lankan state formally withdrew from a 2002 ceasefire to pursue military means to eradicate the LTTE. In that same year, the LTTE and other Tamil organizations in Canada were placed on Canada's list of terrorist organizations. Accusations of terrorism towards Tamil refugee seekers clouded international perception of the severity of Tamil displacement. By 2007, 1 million Tamils were refugee seekers abroad. Around 100,000 lived in refugee camps in Tamil Nadu, India, and 750,000 out of a population of 2 million were displaced within Sri Lanka.
In May 2009, the civil war reached its violent conclusion when the Sri Lankan army surrounded the last portion of LTTE-held land. The UN estimates that 70,000 Tamil people were killed in the final month of conflict. The army specifically designated a no-fire zone for civilians and then proceeded to bomb this area, killing over 500 people in the span of 3 days. Though not universally labeled a genocide, UN reports have cited the occurrence of war crimes such as killing prisoners of war on tape, raping and killing captured women and girls, and dropping barrel bombs on civilian areas as evidence of a bloodbath. The Mullivai-Kal genocide, as it is known to the Tamil people, marked the official end of civil war. Post-war Sri Lanka continues to perceive the Tamil minority as a national security threat. However, it is now their fleeing rather than their presence that is the bigger issue. Increasing numbers of refuge seekers since 2009 signal ongoing internal problems such as repression and state violence. Sri Lanka has also become increasingly dependent on foreign aid, meaning that to a certain extent it must appear to follow international law. Sri Lanka has thus maintained that the majority of asylum seekers are leaving for economic reasons and not because they are fleeing human rights abuses. This rhetoric benefits the Sri Lankan state, which claims to honor human rights, and host countries, who can refuse refuge seekers by labeling them as economic migrants.
In October 2009, 76 Tamil men arrived by boat in Victoria, BC, on a vessel named MV Ocean Lady, and were subsequently placed in detention. Detention tactics were used then again following the arrival of a boat called MV Sensi, which is pictured on our slide here, which carried over 492 Tamil refugees in August of 2010. Recall the Canadian state's reception of Tamil refuge seekers who arrived in Newfoundland in 1986. In contrast to that, the reception of those aboard both MV Ocean Lady and MV Sensi suggests that Tamil refuge seekers were now viewed as a threat to the Canadian way of life. Detaining Tamils makes it seem like the Canadian state required protection from them. And the characterization of Tamils as a security threat by the international community and the labeling of the LTTE as a terrorist organization meant that Tamil refuge seekers' human rights claims were now considered illegitimate. At the time, an editorial published in the National Post read, "In the minds of most of the public, Tamils are all tigers."
International legal remedies introduced in response to the Sri Lankan Civil War and Tamil refuge seekers have not viable solutions to redress Tamil persecution. These ahistorical remedies do not take into account either Sri Lanka's entrenched singular exclusive national identity or the island's absence from various international human rights initiatives like the 1951 Refugee Convention. In October 2015, the United Nations Human Rights Council adopted Resolution 30-1, promising transitional justice in post-Civil War Sri Lanka. In February 2020, Sri Lanka formally withdrew from its commitments, effectively removing any international overview mechanisms.
The situation in Sri Lanka is rooted in a legal, historical, ethnically defined construction of state sovereignty that excludes Tamil peoples from the rights of state-conferred citizenship. which is something that measures like Resolution 30-1 have overlooked. Additionally, both the PSOA and the PTA remain in effect to this day. Only legal solutions enacted by the Sri Lankan state itself can bring perpetrators of Tamil persecution to justice. However, this outcome is unlikely with Sinhalese nationalist representatives in power.
In light of the seemingly worsening conditions of justice and accountability for Tamil communities and victim survivor communities in Sri Lanka, we want to return to the protests staged by the families of the disappeared that we mentioned in the introduction. Just last month, a report released by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights identified that current developments, including the re-election of President Rajapaksa, who served during the Mulivaikal genocide, and his brother, who was the defense minister during the Mulivaikal genocide, risk the recurrence of the grave violations of the past. As seen here with these Tamil mothers who continue protesting for their missing loved ones 4 years into these roadside protests, as they carry tichatis, which are fire pots on their head, and continue marching every day for justice and accountability on behalf of those that were made to be disappeared and those whose lives were lost during that vicious period. Tamils continue to mount an ongoing resistance to the oppressive Sinhala Buddhist state, even amidst these increasing security threats. Thank you so much.
Thank you.